Welcome to our session, Communion, the Centerpiece for Christian Worship. I want to give a shout out to my friend Dr. Vinny Zarletti. So there's been a couple times where I have asked him to make a presentation by this title, and he put this teaching together. He actually has his doctorate from the same institute where I received my master's in worship studies, and he got his master's there as well. And so I said, I'd love you to put together a teaching with this title. He's presented that a couple different times for me, and it's become a big part of his ministry life as well. And so these notes are largely from his preparation, and I thank him for that. So communion, the centerpiece for Christian worship. That could sound like a pretty bold statement. So give me your thoughts on the title of this session. What do you think about that title? Communion is the centerpiece for Christian worship. The centerpiece of Christian worship. What first comes to mind? Either like, what, really? Or, oh, it could be this. Anywhere in there. Anyone?
Once a month.
Someone else?
The reminder of what Christ did.
Yeah, good.
Why do we tack it on to the end of a service?
So if it's a centerpiece, why is it a tack on? Yep. Anyone want to challenge this statement? It's like, no, that's not the centerpiece of Christian worship. This is the centerpiece of Christian worship. Anyone got a strong opinion there?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how we practice communion itself, it doesn't seem like it's something that's the centerpiece. But when we now discuss it, and he just mentioned that it's a reminder of the body of Christ and what was done on the cross, I'm like, oh yes, it is the centerpiece.
Okay, good, Maka, good. All right, so let me ask you a couple of questions. How often do you take communion in your church? Okay, someone back there already said once a month. Is a lot of nodding heads there? Once a month? Any here more often? Some watching maybe more often. Any here less often than once a month? You in a place where it's less often than once a month?
Well, depending on the calendar sometimes.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
it could be 6 weeks, it could be 2 months.
All right.
Doesn't fit into the program.
Yeah. Anyone want to take a stab as to why? That's what we've come up with. I mean, it's a pretty common experience that we have here. So anyone want to try to explain why it's once a month?
Logistics. Communion is a logistical thing.
Okay, so it takes logistics, which takes up time. Okay, good. Anyone else?
Our gatherings are more to reach the unreached, and so communion is an awkward expression when there are many unreached in our setting.
So somehow it's become an awkward expression
Yeah,
because
it's an inside.
if you're not in, you're not partaking, right? Is our approach, right? Our mentality oftentimes, yeah.
Out of fear that'll become routine.
Yes, out of fear that'll become routine, right? So how often do we sing? Oh. How often do we preach? How often do we take offerings? As many times as possible, right? Okay. But that has been reasoning behind it. This is special, and we don't want it to become routine. Next question. In your experience, what is the mood associated with communion? Your general experience, what is the mood associated with communion? Reflective? Somber. I see a lot of heads going up and down. Anyone want to add another adjective or two? I would say those are probably the top two. Okay, so reflective, introspective. Okay, somber, low-key, sad. Okay, yeah, and I would concur. That's been my experience, and it is very common in a lot of our types of settings. So let's start unpacking this a little bit. I'm going to give you some quotes from another author. This is James F. White, in his introduction to Christian worship. And it says this in the book: for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, there was no tight theological distinction about how to understand the Eucharist or communion. It wasn't until the 11th century that distinctions began to be made, and the speculation and the controversies that ensued forced positions to be taken. Okay, just like we talked about all those doctrinal differences, self getting in the way, trying to figure out how we do this relationship with this mysterious God, that leads to differences. And here's what was happening in regards to communion 1,000 years into the history of Christianity. White says that as a result of this, a penitential and introspective piety prevailed rather than a joyful spirit of thanksgiving. He goes on to say, the Eucharist is the most distinctive structure of Christian worship. It is also the most widely used form of worship among Christians. He goes on to say, if the Last Supper was the Passover meal, as the Synoptic Gospels insist, then Jesus was transforming the most solemn occasion of the Jewish year, the festival when the Jews hoped and prayed that the Messiah would appear. So he says, Jews who do not agree the Messiah has come continue to perform the Passover Seder to this day. Christians who agree that Jesus was the Messiah celebrate the Eucharist, which actually means thanksgiving, instead. It is hard to imagine thanksgiving as absent from the joyful action that bubbled over as the Jerusalem church broke bread with glad and generous heart. So he's quoting Acts 2:46 there. So in this session, we are going to explore how we might recover a more robust experience at the Lord's table. Here's another quote from Robert Weber, his book, Worship is a Verb, same book. He says this, the central key to the table is not what I do, but what God does in and through the bread and wine. In short, God acts to proclaim his saving reality and presence to the believer. Consequently, the real meaning of remembrance is a celebration of Christ's resurrection and presence. So the service should bring us through the death to the joy and gladness of his present resurrecting power in our lives. Through the supper, God acts in our midst. He is active in our midst through the supper. So Weber says there is at least a four-sided meaning to the action of eating and drinking at the Lord's table in worship. And here are the four parts. He says there's at least four parts. And these are the four parts he is articulating here. Breaking of bread, which is the presence of Christ and resurrection joy. Okay, so that idea of presence of Christ and resurrection joy, that comes from this is my body, so his presence. And the resurrection joy comes from when he was walking on the road to Emmaus with the two disciples, that his identification was hidden from them. And when did they realize it was him, the risen Christ? When he broke the bread. That's when they realized who it was. So that's where that resurrection joy, we're able to tie in that resurrection joy here. The second one is the Lord's Supper. Okay, this is where we're usually focused, remembering the death. Third one is communion, the mystical union with Christ and each other. There it is. Worship is relationship with God and relationship with others. And then the Eucharist, an offering of praise and thanksgiving. Eucharist literally means thanksgiving. So all of these emotions should be included in our thinking and worship when we gather around the table of the Lord. So let's look to the scriptures. We're going to begin in Exodus chapter 12 with the Passover and the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. For the Jewish people, this deliverance, this salvation was their story. This is what they would remember and celebrate in regards to God's faithfulness and His promises. What God has done, He will do again. Faithfulness, promises. What God has done, He will do again. This is the context of the Lord's Supper in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus is celebrating the Passover with His disciples when He breaks the bread and pours the wine. Ahead of this meal, in John chapter 6, it identifies Jesus as the bread of life. Okay, little side note here. Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem. Anyone here, without looking at your notes, know what that name means, what Bethlehem means? I honestly didn't know this till just very recently. Don't know why. What's that?
The town of bread.
House of bread. House of bread. Bethlehem means house of bread. Jesus calls Himself the bread of life. Isn't that a cool connection? Here's another little side note, okay? One could argue that in every society, the most basic staple of food comes from some type of grain, right? For most of us, in our culture here in this room, that would be bread, which Jesus broke there. But in other cultures, what is another type of grain? Rice. In many, many cultures, rice. That is a grain, and that is the major staple. And even when you think of the Latin community, their major thing is not bread, but like tortillas, and that comes from flour, which comes from a seed of grain, right? So a seed of grain is the major basic staple for all the world, and Jesus is saying, I am the bread of life. So a lot of beautiful pictures here. So the disciples, after feeding the 5,000, Jesus is talking with His disciples. This is John chapter 6. And they are asking Jesus for a sign like Moses gave the Israelites when manna came down from heaven. And what was manna? It was a grain-like seed that they mushed up and made in manna burgers and banana bread and all those things Keith Green said in his song way back. And some of you don't even know who Keith Green is. But, okay, so manna came from a grain, all right? So this is what Jesus is saying in John 6. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, they said, always give us this bread. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. Then, a few verses later, Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink His blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Jesus is simply using language that we can understand and relate to show the picture of relationship and how our sustenance comes from God. All of what sustains life, life itself, and all of what sustains life comes from God. He's using language to make it sound literal, and there's been doctrines and beliefs that have come from this, but what he's saying is, this is relationship. This is relationship. All that I am is what is going to sustain you. So you need, therefore, what sustains us. Food and drink is what sustains us. Air, yes, and then it's food and drink. So we are feasting on who God is, His nature, His work, His words. So when the disciples are gathered with Jesus around the table at the Passover, it is not the first time they are told that Jesus is the bread. So the three synoptic gospels all give account for the dialogue around the table. Matthew 26, Luke 22, and Mark 14. And for the sake of time, we're going to look at just one of these accounts, and that is Mark 14. So while they were eating, this is Mark 14, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. So this is where it started, in connection and fulfillment of the Passover celebration. The very first Christians who met for worship in the book of Acts met around the table in commemoration of this very event. In Acts chapter 2, after the day of Pentecost, and Peter preaches the gospel, 3,000 people were added to the early church. This is what the very next verse says, Acts 2:42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayer. The earliest examples of Christian worship centered on God's word, prayer, and communion. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul gives the Corinthian believers some instructions on the Lord's Supper, also indicating that they are partaking of it every time that they gather for worship. So we will take a look at that passage in this next part, but what I want us to wrestle with for now is the idea that the table of the Lord is a foundational part of corporate Christian worship. The early church seemed to understand this quite well, so perhaps we can learn something from them. For the early church learned that communion is a beautiful picture of worship is life.